Our session today is entitled The Traceability and Transparency Trend, the Environmental, Social and Financial Incentives for Upstream Supply Disclosure. We have a great panel here and are looking forward to a productive discussion. Today it's co-organised by Planet Tracker and the Freedom Fund, and to kick off I would like to pass to Chloe Bailey from the Freedom Fund for an introduction.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Yes, so I just wanted to say a very quick welcome from the Freedom Fund, and we've co-organised this side session with Planet Tracker. The Freedom Fund is an anti-slavery NGO, and in the context of the apparel industry, our programmes look at forced labour in the lower tiers of the apparel supply chain, recognising that the risks of severe exploitation increase further upstream, where companies have less visibility and oversight of working conditions. We therefore fully support initiatives to increase traceability and transparency across the full value chain as a critical component of human rights due diligence to address and prevent forced labour. Through this session, we wanted to combine forces with Planet Tracker to highlight both the labour rights and environmental perspectives on transparency, and also raise awareness around the growing momentum on increased supply chain disclosure. I'm really looking forward to the panelists' important contributions on this topic, and I'll pass over to Catherine to lead us through the rest of the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Chloe. So I'm now going to spend about 5 minutes going through how we think about traceability and transparency at Planet Tracker to help provide some context to this discussion. Just a fast introduction to us at Planet Tracker. I'm Catherine Tubb and I'm the head of Textiles there. And we're a not-for-profit financial think tank seeking to align investor capital with planetary limits and aim to build upon the growing recognition that the finance community is not yet accurately quantifying environmental risks and integrating environmental data into investment valuations and decision making. This is partly caused by a distinct lack of transparency, effective disclosures, and awareness around company and market dependencies on natural resources. And why is this? Well, the textile supply chain is pretty far-reaching and in certain areas very opaque. It consists of thousands of independent companies in a complex network coordinated by textile orders from the brand owner or end retailer. In terms of investors, the focus is predominantly on the brands and retailers, but attention is increasingly focused on the supply chain impacts, and particularly starting to move into those upstream parts of the supply chain, which are responsible for some of the most egregious environmental and social impacts. Traceability and transparency is extremely important to understanding those environmental and social supply chain impacts. So what are traceability and transparency? Well, the ISO defines traceability as the ability to trace the history, application or location of an object. So it relates really to the origin of the materials, the processing, and then the distribution and location of the product after delivery. The UN definition is expanded to add the Y, which is really to ensure the reliability of sustainability claims in the areas of human rights, labour, the environment, anti-corruption. Meanwhile, transparency relates directly to relevant information being made available for all elements of the value chain in a harmonised way, allowing for a common understanding, accessibility, clarity and comparison. And we like to think about transparency in two ways. That first way, which is more about the internal network's transparency, but also the external or publicly disclosed transparency, which has become an increasingly important part of the conversation. The good news is that technology has moved on, so now many traceability tools exist that can allow for full supply chain traceability. In the Planet Tracker view is that we think traceability has three components to it: the systems required to record the movement of products through the supply chain, which are often digital; the tagging aspect, which is the means to identify the product, which is often physical, and these are overseen and supported by certification standards and regulations. This is an important part of our discussion today. As we move this discussion forward, full supply chain traceability is now possible. So how do we make that happen? And how can all parts of civil society help? And also, why is this something brands and investors should get behind? The reasons for better traceability are numerous and well covered. They span across operational, financial and reputational. Examples include better sustainability management and measurement, A key one, to be able to measure and understand environmental and social impacts, which ties into better supply chain risk management, being able to identify and address labour and human rights violations and combat counterfeits. And then we have supply chain efficiency management, which is the idea of being able to improve the profitability through reduced costs and even have higher revenues when communicated well, allowing for consumers to make more informed choices. But challenges still remain. The space remains incredibly dynamic. How can this be built into traceability systems? Due diligence and regulation is still needed. How transparent should companies be? And how do we persuade companies, investors, the importance of transparency? Will it be dictated by regulation or investment? In this panel, we hope to answer some of the questions and start thinking more about what next as traceability and transparency becomes the norm. What do we need to think about in terms of policy and regulation? And how can we really make sure that traceability and transparency reaches the upward parts of the supply chain beyond tier 1 through tier 2, 3, and 4? So before I introduce everyone, we've got a great panel here, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of Q&A. So please submit questions in the usual fashion. And also please look out for a pop-up quiz at some point. This webinar is going to be an hour in length and will finish at 5 p.m. UK time. And I'm delighted today to be joined by a fantastic panel. Paul Roland is a long-time activist working on the intersection of human rights, technology and social change. He's working currently as the transparency lead for the Clean Clothes campaign, a global network dedicated to improving working conditions and empowering workers in the global garment and sportswear industries. And next to that, he's active in various open data and open source communities and trains worker rights activists in digital security and privacy. Also, Nathalie Grillon. Nathalie is the executive director and co-founder of the Open Apparel at Registry. A noted authority on resilient supply chains and open data, she's spoken at length on the need for greater data transparency and the opportunities that open data and interoperability bring to the sector. Also, Maria Teresa Pisani, and Maria is an economic affairs officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, where she's leading the programme on ESG, traceability and transparency of sustainable and circular value chains, including the garment and footwear industry. She's previously worked at the ILO and the European Commission and collaborated with many universities and think tanks. And then also, finally, but not least, Simon Platts, who's the responsible sourcing director for Asos. He's been there for 8 years, and in his role, he oversees the company's sourcing, packaging, ethical trade, product sustainability, and third-party branded engagement functions. He's been part of the industry for over 35 years, starting out in Next Retail in the mid-1980s, before moving through the ranks into visual merchandising, buying and buying management, and finally sourcing. So welcome, everyone. Perhaps I can start with a question to Paul. So you're a long-time activist who's worked in this area for many years. Perhaps you could give a bit of an overview about specifically what's changed over the last 5 years in the company approaches to traceability and transparency, and what are the core challenges going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yes, I think at first it is important to acknowledge that we have already come a long way from 5 years ago. 5 years ago was about the time we started the Transparency Pledge with a number of NGOs and trade unions. And at that time, there were almost no brands that disclosed their tier 1. It was unheard of. It was something that you just didn't do because it would ruin your company. You would never make profit again. That narrative has gone. So we have come a long way. We've also, over those years, seen challenges. One of the major challenges that, for instance, the Open Apparel Registry was created to sort out is that the data that was there was incredibly messy and incredibly difficult to compare. And so we've learned over the past 5 years that transparency and traceability gets better if people cooperate, if people share their data, so that data can be checked, can be looked at by various stakeholders, can be looked at by civil society, can be looked at by workers representatives, And in the end, that is better for everybody when companies and other stakeholders have access to accurate information. There's still a lot of work to be done. We have seen that a large number of companies now at least have a fairly good idea of their tier one supply chain. Most of them have already disclosed it, not all of them, unfortunately, and that still needs addressing. But if we go further up the supply chain, the picture gets a lot messier. There are very few companies that know their full supply chain, and there are even less that actually publish their full supply chain. So there is still a lot of work to be done there, because as said, human rights violations and also environmental violations can happen all across the supply chain, can also happen in the post-consumer phase, which is an area that is still being developed, and that will also need closer examination, especially also on the environmental, but also on social issues. So challenges are first in getting this whole value chain mapped from all the way from fields to to the sourcing of all kinds of materials, to also where all this goes after goes in the post-consumer stage, who gets to recycle it, under what conditions, and for what pay. So those challenges remain. There's a lot of challenges that remain to stop companies freeloading, to create a level playing field for all companies, to make sure that the ones that try to do best do not have to cough up all the resources to do that. So there's plenty of opportunity for regulators there to step in and make sure that this becomes a level playing field for the whole industry.
Great, thank you, Paul. Nathalie, so why do you think companies are not transparent?
I think some of the reasons are probably kept internal, but some of the things that we've shared or that have been shared with Open Apparel Registry in conversations around sharing or disclosing data on the OAR is first of all concerns about data quality, concerns that names and addresses, further information that the brand or retailer may have is not accurate. But as Paul alluded to previously, sharing your data, opening it up, using the OAR to clean your data helps to improve that data quality. So it's actually a mechanism to solve that problem. Second, supply chains are dynamic. They're shifting constantly. You're adding suppliers. You may be moving away from suppliers. Further upstream may be evolving in ways that you're not immediately connected to on a day-to-day basis. And so that can, I think, raise concerns. There's also the lack of regulatory requirements, quite frankly, at this time. Obviously, as Maria Teresa, I think, will share more, that is rapidly changing and will no longer really be an excuse. And then I think there still is, to Paul's point, I think it's really been debunked, but there is still a myth that exists around supply chain being competitive advantage, intellectual property. We've shown with the Open Apparel Registry and other civil society organizations, other brands and retailers have clearly shown by disclosing their data that this is not the case. In fact, you are doing yourself as an organization a disservice from a risk perspective, from a cost perspective. There's really an opportunity to capitalize on that shared data, as you shared earlier, Catherine.
Perhaps you could talk through a couple of instances where the organizations have used the OAR to successfully remediate issues or other practices in the upstream supply chain. That'd be really great for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So we have a wide variety of case studies on our website showcasing how different organizations have used the OAR across their various business functions or to further their mission or causes. One such example directly related to remediating labor abuse would be BHRC, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, was able to swiftly use the OAR to identify brands sourcing from a factory that had dismissed over 1,000 garment workers for striking over non-payment of benefits. DHRC reached out to 2 brands affiliated with the organization via data they had collected from OAR. The brands responded and launched investigations, and through pressure from various quarters, including those brand interventions, the majority of workers were reinstated. And a more recent and quite current case study comes from the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. After the military takeover in Myanmar in February 2021, there was a crackdown, obviously, on demonstrations, and many trade union leaders went into hiding, leaving workers in apparel facilities without the means to elevate concerns via their union leaders. And so the workers and labor organizations sometimes knew the brands that were sourcing from the factory that they could reach out to have these concerns addressed. But they reached out to the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business to aid them in moving more quickly, getting more information. And so using a combination of OAR data, MCRB contacted the sourcing managers at these affiliated brands to help address these possible problems. And as these brands were already concerned about the situation, they were able to quickly connect the brands with the labor organizations who could give them another pair of eyes to these specific factory conditions. So a really compelling current case study there to remediate issues quite quickly.
Great, thank you. And then, as Nathalie mentioned, regulation still needed. So this is a great intro into you, Maria. The role of the policymakers is becoming even more important, we'd argue, now as the technology around traceability is there. So can you give us the policymakers' perspective? What are the measures that policymakers can put in place to support traceability and transparency for due diligence and responsible business models?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. And let me first thank Freedom Fund and Planet Tracker for the invitation to this insightful session. And it's interesting to see how traceability and transparency are becoming so prominent on the sustainability agenda for the industry. As Paul said, that was not the case a few years ago. It was a topic towards which there was quite some resistance on the industry side, claiming that is something challenging, too complex to do, while nowadays we see, as Nathalie explained, it is possible. I mean, it's happening. So definitely let's see how this can be scaled up. And this, let me start by saying that actually you can definitely improve what you can measure. So that's why traceability and transparency are becoming and are seen more and more key to address the ESG challenges along the value chain, particularly in the upstream part, and come up with claims about sustainability performance that are reliable, that are verifiable, and can be trusted. And this is not only by consumers, but also by investors and regulators and value chain business partners. Now, there are two distinct and complementary concepts, because traceability, as you rightly said, Catherine, is about gaining internal visibility on transaction and sustainability performance, while transparency is about disclosure, first in their internal and then external. And they should concern products, processes, and factories, from the raw material production and processing through point of purchase and beyond. They really need to cover the whole value chain. Key is to start from traceability, which is necessary to identify, prevent, and mitigate the risk and impact, and then gradually move towards transparency, because data privacy and security from the work we are doing at UNECE and issues related to IP rights are a challenge. Still, there is a lot of sensitivity around this. We see that in implementation of our blockchain pilots, where we work with brands and their value chains, and this is definitely still something that needs to be addressed properly. Now, coming from the policymakers' perspective, in our view, there is a need for a smart mix that needs to happen at 3 levels. And this is what we have addressed in our UNECE toolbox and sustainability pledge, focusing on traceability and transparency of the value chain. So at the policy level, there is a need certainly for a level playing field and for legal certainty. There has been a clear call on the industry, from the industry on this. You need clear rules of the game, and that's why policy regulations and norms play a very important role. But from our point of view, it's as we are seeing and witnessing an acceleration in normative production. There is also a need for policy coherence, because if you have a fragmented policy regulatory framework, that is also going to pose a challenge, and especially for the upstream part and the producing countries. So that policy coherence is an important element. At the standard level, there is a need to go for global traceability and transparency standards. The OER is an example. The UNECE traceability and transparency approach and standard is another example that help really to define a common business and data model and ensure interoperability between existing data management systems. There are a lot of traceability systems out there, but we need to make sure that they can talk to each other and provide really to the business and to the industry that common language they need for a seamless and easy exchange of data, documents, and evidence along the value chain. And then you have the technology layer. And we have seen that blockchain, artificial intelligence, but also DNA markers, RFIDs, and now satellite imaging can really be of big support to advance traceability and transparency. Now, of course, the tech transfer and the access to technology from the small-scale actors in the upstream part of the value chain are very important. So that partnership between the downstream and upstream part of the value chain, in our view, plays a very important role. The trust among these actors along the value chain play a very important role to allow the necessary exchange of data for risk management and due diligence.
Great. And what, in terms of disclosure then, what, in your view, what's the road forward there? Because in order to meet the kind of growing expectations amongst many of us in the community about that in the industry.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that doing traceability and transparency is costly. It's an effort that requires skills, requires access to technology, requires resources. So I think in order to come up, with an increasing disclosure, you need this engagement and effective engagement of value chain upstream actors. And for that, from a policymaker's perspective, I think there is a need for investment, targeted investment funds, targeted capacity building programs, initiatives for tech transfer and access to affordable technology solution with tailored instruments, and especially with, let's say, the flexibility and the transition time that is necessary to get on board all the value chain actors and especially the upstream. There is a need for incentives, financial, non-financial, preferential tariffs or trade facilitation for compliant actors that also need to be built in trade facilitation agreement, the sustainability development, the sustainability chapters of trade facilitation agreements. So to conclude, just for a transformational change, the industry action needs really to be integrated, both upstream, downstream. You need to have shared responsibility and have also the MNEs upstream that need to play an important role and help SMEs to adopt traceability practices and to provide know-how and the right system for compliance with due diligence requirements.
Thank you, Maria. And then moving on to Simon. So why has Asos made Be Transparent a key goal for its Fashion with Integrity programme?
Well, I think I'll go into a little bit of detail, but first of all, I would just say, because of what you've all just heard, Now, we decided at Asos, for us, this was not an option, this was an imperative. And it was something that we put at the heart of what we do. Transparency for us has been the key approach to understanding our supply base. If you don't know where you are, then you can't fix what you don't know. You don't know what you're standing on, you don't know what you're dealing with, then you simply can't deal with it. Last year, when we relaunched our Fashion with Integrity commitments, we had 4 key goals. And one of those 4 key goals was transparency and traceability. And obviously, it does start with the traceability part, all the way through the value chain. And it's something it's got to be done. I would say, again, I wouldn't wait for a level playing field. I don't know if we'll ever get a level playing field. There's things going on and things moving all the time. But don't wait for that. You never win the race looking over your shoulder or waiting for something to change. You know, go ahead and do what's right for you as a responsible business. That's the way we approached it. We weren't afraid to engage. Nathalie talked about this, but we work very, very closely with several NGOs. We have a global framework agreement with Industry All, so that we're able to really understand what's going on in that space. We work with Anti-Slavery International to remedy issues around the world, most recently what we've been doing in Mauritius and associated with modern slavery. So, you know, don't be afraid to get support and to work closely. And I think, Catherine, when we had a little chat on Friday, I talked to you about a new word that I've kind of adopted. We collaborate. This industry, the clothing industry, the retail industry, collaborate a lot on lots of different things. But do we what I call co-opetition? And that is really collaborating and cooperating with your competition to change the landscape, to do things quicker. Now, you could argue, and I'd argue it implicitly, that having visibility, having traceability, and then transparency in your supply chain is the responsible and right thing to do. Complex and convoluted and opaque though it may be, it is time to roll your sleeves up. And I'd say that's the start point. If you've not started it, then roll your sleeves up and literally start making the phone calls to understand where you are and right the way through the value supply chain. I'd also say it's important from a cadence point of view. You probably all know about the new competitive markets law that came out earlier this year and what you can say. And I do want to tell a story about our product, and I want to be able to tell that where it can be verified, where a customer can be confident that what I'm talking about is truthful, honest, and gives them enough information to make an informed choice. We all, with information, can make more informed and better choices. So, you know, really just starting and you know, we've been working on this. I've been here nearly 8 years, and it was something that I got hold of very, very quickly, having had the history that you mentioned I'd had earlier, and the kind of upbringing in a company like UNECE, where, again, let's be honest, we need to know where we are so that we can impact things for better. But I'll be frankly honest with you. On another hand, if you know where you are as a retailer, you're able to have better conversations, more informed conversations. You may be able to consolidate. You may be able to negotiate a better deal. So there's a commercial aspect to this as well as being able to make the landscape different and to work with the better people and start to move away from the ones that you perhaps don't feel are able to come with you on the journey you've set yourself. And I know we've set ourselves some big ambitions over the next 8 years on our Fashion with Integrity commitments. And we'll need to be, you know, we'll need to know that supply chain so that we can make the right decisions throughout the supply chain to achieve the targets and ambitions we've set ourselves. It's never too late to start. As I say, I would say it's an imperative. It's a very important value supply chain, and that's how we should view it, right the way through to we go to a 5th tier, so we go to tier 5, just to sort of break it out a little bit more, because it is very complex. I think using technology and innovation, again, really important things. There is a lot of, you know, I think Maria was just talking there about satellite imagery, DNA. I mean, there's so much coming in this space. A lot of it's, if you like, in its sort of startup stage, but there are accelerators, there are things that are moving, and that's currently where I'm at, trying to map further down the supply chain. So very well mapped to tier 3, but getting through to those lower levels to fields, forest and farm, where lots of things are going on, very different to what might be going on in the higher tiers, but just as important to solve from a people and a planet perspective. So for us, it wasn't an option. It wasn't something we said, oh, well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. We felt to have a responsible business and be able to talk about what we do in a validated way, that having traceability and then moving into transparency and talking about it and making changes was for us an imperative.
I guess that leads quite nicely on, Simon, to in terms of Asos, where are they in their journey, and what are the kind of the main challenges that you see coming up in terms of either traceability or transparency or both?
Well, for us, tiers 1 to 3, we're mapped, we're fully mapped, and we've been working on it, and I'm working now as part of the third-party branded engagement program to encourage the brands that we sell on Asos to sign the transparency pledge. We did that recently in the UK. I mean, a lot of you guys will have heard about what was happening in the UK around wages and exploitation. And you know, I live in Leicestershire, so I know exactly what people were talking about. And we said that any brand that manufactures in the UK would need to sign up to a certain set of commitments, one being to sign the transparency pledge. So we were able to use the platform, if you like, of Asos to help move the needle, not just for our own brand, but also the brands that we sell. So for us, it really is important. We've done a great job, like I say, 1 to 3. Now we're working through the lower levels, and this is where we're trying to use technology to help us, because it's one thing getting the visibility, but then once you've got the visibility, what are we going to do with that? So the FEM, the Higg Index, the SAC, this is a really good space to operate in, so that you're capturing data on both social and environmental issues, and using, you know, there are lots of different tech companies out there offering lots of different solutions. I've got some that I'm more interested in than others. They don't all quite deliver you the tailored approach. In fact, I wish I'd have created this myself, if I'm honest, because I think I know where the gaps are, but I'm working with some of those other companies now to try and plug the little holes where I think they're perhaps a little bit weak in terms of that transparency. There's also
where do you think those holes are? Feel free to share. The holes, where you think the holes are?
I guess it's when you get down to the field, the forest and the farms that is the hardest part. You know, knowing where you're manufacturing a garment, where you're washing it, where you're printing it, where you're embroidering it, where you're getting the fabric from, where you're then getting the yarn from. It's an easier part, but when you get to the field, forest and farm, because that's where the industry does go kind of off, because we're talking blends on cottons, you know, you're doing lots of different things to pull yarns together. It gets a little bit, you know, that's where I guess the opaqueness is. And I think that's where the digital part will really play its part, because blockchain, things that ultimately give you that cadence over a receipt of a transaction that gives you the full visibility on that value added chain is what's going to be important. Talking to suppliers, getting people to understand why this is not a competitive space. Nathalie touched on it, Paul, at the beginning. This idea that by not telling people your supply base, you're gaining a competitive edge or an advantage. Well, someone needs to tell them this thing's called iPhones, and you can find out where anybody's. It's just not a thing anymore. I think it was Nathalie that said it was debunked a while ago, and it was, but people still use it. And I've had challenges talking to brands that are kind of holding on to this. No, well, I don't want to give you that because, you know, you might use that, and it's like, it doesn't work like that anymore. You know, this is about what's right. And actually, if you think about where the customers are going with this, not just from a legal point of view, but from a you know, responsible behaviours of us as consumers, we will want to know things. And I think any company that doesn't have that transparency or can't put themselves in a place where they can be transparent, be open, and talk about the things that they're dealing with, I think that's where you will lose a competitive edge, and ultimately, you know, you might then get taken out by the legislation or those that may come in time. But you know, I'm not waiting for that. I think it's right to behave in the right way, whatever we do in life. And so, you know, we shared that as a business, and that's why we went where we went. But it is complex, but there is no other way other than metaphorically to roll your sleeves up and start digging into your supply base, and then looking at the technologies that can support you. And then, as I've done, working with some of those technology companies, just where it needed perhaps a little bit of refining in terms of how we're going to pull that into a system that really does give us that 100% guarantee that we can verify that this is where it came from. And I think there's still more to do in that space, if I'm honest.
I mean, it's good to hear from the brand perspective that essentially it sounds like the brands are, well, assuming Asos is all brands, which I'm sure it's not, but the idea that it's fairly inevitable, right? This change, regulation is going to come in, people are going to be expected to share data. So I think if the brands take that stance, we should see more movement. I think, so we just talked there a little bit, you talked about the problems with kind of mapping the supply chain, which both Paul and Nathalie have talked to, especially kind of the lower levels. So I guess, Nathalie, and how do we go about mapping this area? What are the kind of things that you want to see or you've been doing to really help on that part?
Yeah, I mean, this might sound a little obvious, but maybe not. I don't think that an organization should look for full supply chain traceability before sharing, right? Before disclosing, before opening up your data, right? It can proceed in stages. And what we've seen actually is that transparency helps a lot with traceability. It connects you with, I mean, if you're using OAR, it connects you with an ecosystem of partners on the ground, subcontractors, the companies, the parent companies of a facility. That facility is a part of an ecosystem, and that ecosystem will help you towards your goals around people, planet. So I think traceability and transparency go hand in hand. They really need to proceed in tandem. I think also I just emphasize what Maria Teresa said about this concept of an interconnected data system, an interconnected ecosystem. And to Simon's point as well, there's a lot of different startup platforms, technology providers out there offering similar but slightly different innovations. And so as we look down the roadmap for our collective efforts as a sector, interoperability and a shared data model that Maria Teresa said earlier is critical. If we operate in silos, we will be making a lot more work for ourselves in the long run. You can't have everyone operating and sharing these supply chains, but gathering their own data. So we have to think about that interconnectedness and interoperability. And OAR plays a critical role in helping to facilitate that with our OAR ID, which provides that unique open ID that everyone can use to exchange data on a per facility basis. I do want to say the final thing is I think the apparel sector, we've been doing a lot of looking at other sectors, electronics, beauty, it's just sort of as a mapping exercise for what we're looking at in the future. And the apparel industry should give ourselves some credit. We have really made a lot of progress compared to some other industries in terms of our transparency and in terms of our collaboration. By no means is the effort finished, but other industries look to the apparel and footwear sector for the progress we've made. So let's continue to show that leadership and continue to push down the supply chain, model what that interconnected model of transparency and traceability looks like.
And yeah, Paul, so what, in terms of the role of the worker in this lower levels of supply transparency, do you see a role for them in there?
Yes, there's definitely a role for workers and worker rights organizations because they signal problems. I also think we should really change the whole narrative on sort of like traceability and transparency. There's this sort of idea that first you do the traceability and then when everything is right, you go to transparency. And that has been sort of like the failure of the social auditing model, is that it was designed to give you a clean slate of health. Well, let me tell you something, nobody has a clean slate of health in this industry. So the metric shouldn't be sort of like, if I publish that I have problems in my supply chain, that's not airing your dirty laundry. That's actually making an effort to make a change. If you don't find issues in your supply chain, you're not looking in the right place. And you cannot fix what you cannot find. So, and in helping you find issues in your supply chain, workers are critical because they are the ones that, not only workers, but also affected communities in the case of chemicals. Sorry. They are basically on the front line, and if they have a reliable mechanism to tell people that things are wrong, that should not be something that you say like, oh help, somebody's saying I'm doing there are issues. Let me tell you, there are issues. Every brand has issues. The metric should be, how do you solve them? Nobody will be surprised that their issues will turn up. You will get more recognition for helping to solve them in a speedy way and getting some form of retribution to workers and fixing those issues. So finding an issue, be it through workers, be it through other stakeholders, should be seen as a positive. It shouldn't be seen as something that is deeply scary and that you should try to hide until you have fixed everything. So that's where I think workers are really important, to make them verify information, to make it easier for them to report information. You can actually find things, because as said, you cannot fix what you didn't find.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and then I guess going to you, Maria, in terms of policy and the upstream part of that supply chain, how do we really make sure we include that in the discussion? Have you had any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Let me say that I totally agree with Simon when he mentioned that in the industry there is a need for goodwill and leadership, and such a goodwill and leadership in the work we have been doing, engaging with the brands, with the manufacturers, with farmers, is definitely there. There is a need for guidance and for helping them navigate in the ecosystem of tools and solutions and guide them through application. At the supply chain level, certainly I see a lot of let's say, good readiness in the manufacturing segment of the value chain. Manufacturers are there, they see the need, they see the relevance of doing work on traceability and transparency of the value chain, and they have been engaging with a lot of enthusiasm in the work we have been doing. It's more complex when you talk with brands, because the data privacy security issue, it's very sensitive there. So coming to, and they show what Paul was mentioning, that they tend to, engage and go for transparency where when they can be 100% sure on the traceability of the value chain. So they are much more cautious. While at the manufacturing level, in that segment of the value chain, you see more readiness to go for it. The farming level, the other extreme of the value chain, is again complex. It's another industry. It's the agri-industry, it's not the manufacturing industry. And there is a disconnect between the manufacturing, the agri. There are traders in between. So reach out to the farming level is challenging, making sure that they have also access to the tools and the approaches, and they know how to do the collection of data and the sharing of data is something that needs to be addressed. So at the policy making government level, I agree, there is no need for, this full level playing field in order to move forward. We can do it already, but yet norms and standards and the capacity building and investment support that is necessary is something that policymakers and governments need to put in place in order to achieve the scale that we need to have, to accelerate the action. So they do play a role to achieve a wider and larger scale, and the one we need to move fast.
Thanks, Maria. And then on the theme of cooperation, which is definitely kind of, I think, been mentioned several times in terms of people working together, technologies working together, companies working together, I guess perhaps, Simon, you could give a little bit more colour around the idea of how corporates can actually cooperate through transparency, and if you guys at Asos have done anything specific around that.
Yeah, well, I guess we sell over 1,000 brands as well as the Asos brands that we have. So collaborating with those brands, we've been doing for many, many years, and we want to drive that even harder because they want to sell on Asos. We want to sell them on Asos, but we have a certain set of standards and rules that we adhere to. We want them to be able to follow that same route, if you like. Now, many of those brands maybe even ahead of us on some of the part of this journey, but a lot of the brands will be further behind. So we work very closely with those brands to bring them in to help them understand what the landscape looks like and what kind of issues they need to be aware of. The modern slavery statement in the UK was one of the best things, and we're pushing to make that actually a little bit more set in law than just a basic bit of information that a company that turns over more than 30 million has to write a one-pager. It should be transparent. It should be talking about the things that are in their supply chain, giving everyone the assurances that they know what they're talking about. So we've done that with our platform, but then we've taken it broader. So we work now very closely with some of what you would consider our competition, and that gets to that co-opetition part again. We're working with the likes of Zalando, and we're looking at the different ways we could partner together that would be better for the industry, for both the platforms, because we share the suppliers. So I suppose we're using our collaborative and our power of purchase and the platform that we have to try and drive the industry to work closer together, rather than, as Teresa was saying, that people working in silos and waiting for someone else to do it. There are people starting to drop off already in our industry because for many reasons, and I think we're going to see more. And I think part of the reason why a lot of these companies will start to fail in the not too distant future will be because they won't be able to step up and talk about actually what they really are. They're aware of what's going on in their supply chain, and they're not afraid to dig into it and to deal with the issues. So for us, it's been about working with our partners, our own supply base, but then working with the brands that we work with, but then through other initiatives like the ACT initiative on living wage, where there are brands as part of that initiative or as part of the ETI that are not selling on Asos, but it's a forum where we can come together and join forces, if you like, to try and ensure that we are eradicating the problems that we know the industry faces, again, from both people and a planet perspective. So that's kind of how we've tackled it. We've gone into it, eyes open, knowing that there are issues, not trying to say that there aren't issues, or let's not tell anyone about anything we're doing until we've got our own house in order, which obviously, generally speaking, we all like to say, well, hang on, I better not say anything until I know exactly everything. Well, if we wait for that moment, we're going to be waiting forever. It's a case of sharing that information and going through it and sharing it as we go through it, so that, again, you're making something that was opaque transparent. That's the approach that we've taken.
And Nathalie, where are you seeing the best cooperation, and where do you think it might need to improve?
We've seen great examples like the case studies I shared earlier, civil society collaborating directly with brands and retailers and facilities to remediate immediate emergencies or issues on the ground. And those are day-to-day things that are happening. I think it's fantastic that it's happening so much more frequently than it used to be. We've also seen, to Maria Teresa's point earlier about the interconnected data ecosystem, multi-stakeholder initiatives, service providers connecting to the OAR API to be able to connect data systems in real time and exchange information, which is and data on a per facility basis, which is exactly the kind of cooperation I think we want to see more of in the future. And then to your question around upstream supply chain mapping and disclosure, we're seeing outreach from more organizations looking at product traceability tied to transparency, as well as organizations working on the ground with farmers, working on deforestation. How can we use the OAR in our work? How can we collaborate with all of the hundreds of contributors that you have? So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of progress already happening. In terms of improvements, the luxury industry is not very transparent about their supply chains. There are very few that disclose, and yet in many cases, they showcase themselves as leaders from a sustainability standpoint. So I think there needs to be some real momentum and shifting there in terms of sharing.
Why do you think that is that because they have a lot of their supply chains in-house, or do you think it's for other reasons? They're just greenwashing a bit?
I mean, Paul and others might be able to share some of what they've heard. We've heard the competitive advantage argument made, which we've obviously debunked. We've heard IP concerns. You know, oh, well, the handbags are going to be counterfeited. I mean, that's already happening. So I don't really think they already know what you're doing. So I don't really think not that. I just think there's so many benefits from supply chain disclosure and transparency and open data that this argument just doesn't hold weight anymore to all the points we made earlier. So there's not anything original that I've heard. But I do want to say that the things that Simon is talking about, some of the practices we're seeing from other brands, taking transparency and open data beyond disclosure to actually implementing it and using it, those create the case studies that help to debunk those myths. Those create the momentum and the co-opetition that Simon's talking about that we need to see more of. So that's where we'd like to see more improvement. And obviously upstream, just more disclosure that will lead to more cooperation in the areas where we need to see it most.
Co-opetition is going to happen, Simon. I can see this word. And Maria, you've got your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Yes, just compliment on what Nathalie was mentioning from the experience of engaging with the downstream actors, brands and retailers, and their, you know, I would say resistance a bit to go transparent. I would say two main reasons. One is the reputational risk. You know, before exposing themselves, they prefer. I mean, I understand they would like to have a better understanding and visibility of the value chain, which is something that is not there. Most of them do not have such a visibility of their value chain. They reach to their tier 1, tier 2, but definitely do not go up to the tier 3 and tier 4. And even those that are more vocal, I would say, on the sustainability and on the sustainability and responsibility in the value chain. So reputational risk issues, lack of full visibility, and certainly the intellectual property issues is there. Data privacy, data security is a challenge also for them. But yes, but the first one is, I would say, the important one.
And Paul, do you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, but I think Simon was actually before me.
Oh, sorry, Simon.
I think we were banging together there, Paul. Mine was just a very quick one. It's just to Michelle on one of the chats about disclosure being used as greenwashing, and who verifies that if it's disclosed, is it verifiable? And I think that is also another challenge, because we need to ensure that, you know, there's a lot of verification out there at the minute on organic cotton that now is being challenged. So the industry needs to ensure that if it is using certifications or verification or blockchain to confirm that this is what it says it is, that is understood, and that is held, you know, if you like, in its own right to account, so that, you know, the last thing you want to be doing is thinking we've done something and we actually haven't. So that's really important.
Yeah, and then Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, well, on the topic of sort of like where more cooperation is desperately needed, I do want to refer to the elephant in the room, which is sort of like purchasing practices. Brands are very reluctant to disclose their purchasing practice because that is financial information. But you do need responsible purchasing practice to actually be able to pay a living wage, and especially further up the supply chain. So there we do need more cooperation, because yes, this is of course financial information which is sensitive, but there are established models in there. Companies regularly disclose sensitive information to tax authorities, to financial oversight bodies, in the case of mergers, or to their accountants. So there can be ways in which you could sort of like audit or check on purchasing models, on purchasing prices, without actually disclosing those prices themselves, because that's probably a step too far. But you should be able to get agreed upon metrics on whether a company is using sustainable purchasing practices, and that could be reported in a way that also investors have sort of like metrics to go on. So there could be cooperation in devising metrics that say how far are you in sustainable purchasing practices without literally telling your FOB price, because that definitely is a step too far at this moment. But there are ways in which that could be done by accountants, by regulators, by people without, as said, fully disclosing them. But it is the elephant in the room, because yeah, you need to have responsible sourcing practices in order to create a sustainable value chain, and that needs to be sort of like accounted for in your metrics, in the metrics that you present to investors as well, because then you can also see if you are improving year over year on that.
Yeah, and I know stuff like that is desperately needed by the investment community to kind of ensure that they can account for that transparency. And I agree, like when we get to a point with transparency, we're talking about supply chains, but it doesn't really stop there. It can go through the whole kind of practice, and arguably we need that transparency through the whole kind of practice of business. I just want to try and turn to a couple of the questions in the chat box. I guess this might be for Maria, I might be wrong though, what the role of the EU taxonomies play to enhance transparency, from David there. Is that something you can answer, Maria?
Yes, thanks for the question. I was looking at the chat, in fact. I would say that at the EU level, with the EU textile strategy that is upcoming, the EU action plan on circular economy, the plan for the EU non-financial reporting directive, and now this upcoming due diligence directive on mandatory due diligence. I mean, from the discussion we're having with the Commission, we see that traceability and transparency are seen in all these policy regulatory efforts as a key enabler for advancing due diligence, sustainability, circularity in the garment and footwear sector. So certainly they are at the heart, I would say, of this policy regulatory effort in the EU. And the digital product passport, the environmental product passport are going in that direction. So the work that we have been doing at UNECE is exactly to provide this EU policy regulatory effort with an implementation tool. So the guidelines, the traceability and transparency business and data model that we have developed at the UN goes in that direction of providing the industry with implementation tools to move forward on the traceability and transparency efforts, full aligned with the other standards like the OER, like EON. I mean, important global standards that are there out to support the industry in that effort.
Brilliant. And then I just guess the final question, perhaps for Paul, is you started with what has happened 5 years ago. So what, if we're looking ahead 5 years, what do you hope for, and what do you think we're going to have to focus on once all this is solved, or what next?
I'm not sure we will solve all of it in 5 years, but I do hope that there will be some form of at least mandatory disclosure of your, let's say, the first 2 tiers. That should be within reach of everybody, and that we also start becoming more open about wage levels and other endemic problems in this industry, because as said, you need to produce information before you can measure improvement. So I do hope that that will become, that will have become standard, and also that you actually cannot claim to have a sustainable product if you cannot show it. So if you want to, I'm not sure all actors by then will do it, but at least the forerunners, when they say like, you can totally trust us, we have ethical goods, then please show us the evidence. That should be the minimum standard in 5 years.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. And sorry for not getting to the questions. We'll try and get back to you on those over the next few days. But thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the OECD and Freedom Fund. And goodbye.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And